Today we're going to be talking about grunting, shouting, making noise while lifting. What we're mainly going to focus on is the actual effect it has. If anyone has watched the training vlogs of like building up to the 500-pound squat and the 5-minute mile attempt, there's a fair few comments in that about like grunting while lifting. And when I was weightlifting, I used to make noise when I especially do like a heavy clean. And it was something always people asked about. These comments tend to fall into two different categories. The first category is like, it just happens. And then the second category is somebody used to do it, they don't do it now, and they think it's way better. And there seems to be like this huge amount of reasons why making noise while lifting is bad. What I decided to do today is look into one of the kind of better or more rigorous studies in this area, start talking about what happens in your neurological setting when you start shouting and why it might be positive and why it might be negative for you doing maximal lifts and shouting at the same time. So making noise or kind of outward audible expression while doing some sort of maximal sporting event isn't a new thing, right? All of you will be fairly familiar with like certain tennis players, particularly female tennis players. A lot of you who will have been involved in American football, in rugby, in any sort of kind of high contact sport will be fairly familiar with the thing of like heave.
It's okay. There's the feet from Lochinitsi. And again, Georgia try and get that push on. I'll tell you what, that is a brilliant scrum by the Georgians and they have penalty.
Or of the shadow boxing and the each time you're shadow boxing. Then obviously, most of you who watch this channel will be into lifting weights. Powerlifters will make noise, especially when pulling on a deadlift, the odd time while squatting and bench pressing. And of course, we have some weightlifters who make these kind of audible outbursts as they're lifting. So what's going on here? There's a number of different things happening. In the case of the contact sport thing or the pushing thing where you'll hear someone saying heave, the original background to that, or what the original kind of wives' tale around that was, that when you make that noise, that heave, you get this inward compression. So you get a contraction of initially your diaphragm, then all of your kind of anterior abdominals, and you get this contraction around the spinal column, which now we would call bracing. So it's a form of audible cueing for bracing. It makes sense if you have 8 guys pushing against another 8 guys and one of them have well braced spines, they're going to be able to push harder against the other 8 guys who mightn't have braced quite as well. There's also an element to it in a team sport where you get this coordination of teams, coordination of players, and everyone starts pushing at the same time or pushing in the same direction, and obviously a coordinated effort is better. We're not really concerned about that today. What we're mostly concerned about is the actual acute effects of this kind of once-off, discrete shout, grunt, whatever you want to call it, and luckily we have some really, really good studies have been done on it. The first place we started seeing these kind of studies popping up, or the first place I came across this, was when you get standardization of study environment, or you get standardization of methods across multiple squatting studies. It just so happened I was really interested in squatting when I was in university, and these were the ones I look at most often. In all methods, in any way decent papers, they will have standard environment was recognized for all. In the slightly more rigorous ones, they will talk about how that environment was modulated. And in the more rigorous, again, it will talk about the level of verbal encouragement, if there was shouting, so this is very, very common. For those of you who aren't involved in a sports science setting, it might sound quite funny that you have a lab full of experimenters shouting at a single participant, but this is what will happen on a very, very daily basis. What happens though in the neurology of that weightlifter, that powerlifter, that cyclist, when they are in a loud environment, they're getting a large amount of neural stimulation. So neural stimulation from external stimuli and from internal stimuli. If they're shouting themselves, so shouting may or may not be allowed. If they're shouting themselves, what's happening in their brain, and if people are shouting at them, what's happening, and vice versa. So as you all know, strength training or training for power, speed, strength isn't just a more muscle is stronger muscle, which means bigger weights. To a certain extent, at a certain point in time, that can be true. But for most of you, when you start training, or for the majority of your training career, the vast amount of actual strength gains you're going to make will be a combination of neurological and physiological strength gains. So what happens when we get neurologically stronger? Well, we get a host of things happening. We get more skilled and more coordinated contraction of motor units. So that means if I contract my forearm here, all of the musculature in my forearm will contract at the same time, thus making me stronger. What we also get is we get a faster contraction. So if I decide now that I'm going to tense my fist, for a non-skilled participant, that tensing or that kind of contraction of the fist will take a lot longer than for a skilled participant. And that's not just due to the fact that there's a certain expectation or that I will understand that I'll need to contract faster. There's actual physical differences in the neurological structure of a skilled participant versus non-skilled. I know we're kind of getting away from shouting here for a sec, but it will come back to make a lot of sense in a sec. So in a skilled participant, what we often see is we see a more comprehensive neural structure. So the amount of nerves they have actually going to the motor units could increase. If you were to take a cross section, so if you took a buzzsaw and cut my forearm in half here, and you took a cross section of this forearm, due to the fact that I am right-handed, I could have up to 3 times more neural structure, so nerve fibers, myelin sheaths, in this arm than I will in my non-dominant arm. If you imagine this to be the skilled participant and this to be the non-skilled participant, it's really clear to see that the neurological adaptation that happens with training is really, really significant. There are also other things like the myelin sheaths that are around our nerves. The more myelin sheath we have, the faster that nerve signal travels down our central and our peripheral nervous system, and the quicker we're able to contract. So is there something that happens when we're shouting, grunting, roaring, making noise, getting shouted at? Is there something that happens in our brain that allows us to be faster, more powerful, to contract for longer? So it's similar in many ways to the thing Owen would have referred to in the last few weeks when he referred to nasal breathing versus kind of oral breathing. A change happens when we shift from kind of everyday normal breathing nasally to a mouth breathing. What we get is a shrinking of peripheral vision. So we get a kind of narrowing of our visual scope. We then get a much faster or more impulsive decision-making schema. So we don't tend to dwell on things too much. We tend to just make rash, quick decisions. These are not ideal in everyday life. Absolutely they're not. If you're just walking around mouth breathing the whole time with no peripheral vision and you make snap, impulsive decisions, you mightn't be in a great place. But if you're getting chased down on the Sahara by a lion, or if you're getting chased by a bear through the woods, you need to be able to see things with a narrow scope of view. You need to be able to make decisions quickly. And this is very much a kind of fight or flight response. Thankfully, these days we don't have too many of those situations for our everyday people, or most people in the world don't have to make too many decisions like that if they're running from things. But what we now get is we get a huge amount of the population, male, female, across all age categories, start to get into these kind of situations in a sporting or a competitive environment. So although we're not being chased down by a buffalo, we are being run down by our opposite number in a rugby match, or we're sprinting against someone, or we're fighting them in an MMA ring. What does this have to do with shouting while lifting though? And I'm sure you're asking that now. Well, shouting while lifting allows us to increase the level of neural drive we have at that distinct point. So it basically increases things like catecholamines, all those neurotransmitters that are so important for muscle contraction. They all get ramped up when we shout. When we look at this study, and the great thing about this study that hasn't been done in the past, it actually looks at that level of neural stimulation. It looked at it in 2 different ways. So it tracked the level of pupil dilation. It also tracked the level of neural activity that was happening. And it showed that in the group that shouted, there was far more neural activity happening, right? This is all getting ramped up. We get more of those neurotransmitters produced, which means we can fire those signals down the central nervous system faster. But we now know that we can contract the muscle harder, we can probably react faster, and we can get an overall better response to stress when we are doing that kind of shout response. So we're probably going to be able to squat more weight, pull more weight, snatch more weight. We'll probably jump higher. We'll probably be more powerful in a tackle. But what are the negatives here? So there are a number of negatives, and a negative that often pops up in the comment section is that you're wasting energy. You're not wasting energy per se, that you're wasting something else that we're going to talk about later. But the energy that's going to be used during a shout isn't significant enough for it to have any effect over your lift, your jump, your throw, whatever it is. They're completely different systems. They're distinct from each other. You're not asking someone to do sign language as they box. So that's not really a valid issue or a valid concern right now with these things we're talking about. But there are some other really, really valid concerns. So the next thing is the environment you train in. Being in an environment full of really, really high drive is great. Like the West Side Barbell method, right, where it's a, I forget what they call it, like the dog fight, the fight cage, the shark tank, pure killers jiu-jitsu, whatever it is. That environment is great for maximal lifts. It's great for really, really training hard. But it may not be great for long-term progression. And that's the next thing, is that neural load is the same as physical load, in the same way where if we squat every day and go really, really heavy all the time, you're going to get beaten down and worn down, and that training effect will lose its effectiveness. We'll dampen that receptor site. We won't really pick up on all that stimulus we're given, purely because the fact the load is so high all the time. This is the exact same for all those neurotransmitters, all those things that are getting ramped up as we're shouting and getting hyped up. If we do this every day in every training session, it's just not going to be as effective. So what you'll often find is a kind of new powerlifter might start shouting before they squat, and then they're shouting before they squat, and somebody's shouting at them, and they're shouting as they're squatting. And this goes the whole way through to people sniffing ammonia while getting hit in the face, then they're getting slapped on the back, then they headbutt the bar, and then they're roaring as they're unracking the bar. It's just this kind of slippery slope thing. If you start off and you're squatting 200 kilos and you do it for a single and you shout like mad when you're doing it, to go and do 220, you're probably going to need more stimulation to get there. To do 250, you'll need more stimulation to get there, unless you kind of reassess and change things each time. But it is a very, very slippery slope, and you don't want to be the guy who's like fucking setting fireworks off inside in the gym just to try and get hyped up. Ideally, if we're in a well-moderated, well-thought-out training system, we would only use this as the cherry on top. This is the final piece. This is what we do at the very, very end for our maximal attempts. So what I'd be really interested to find out is how you find it, if you make noise or if you don't make noise while you lift. Some of the questions that we often get is like, will it affect me? I'm worried that other people in the gym are doing it and I'm not doing it, or I used to do it and I won't be able to lift as heavy if I don't do it again. This is more of a concern, obviously, because loads of you were training at home and now you might be going back to a gym, and you might just be used to making noise while you train at home and you're worried about it in the gym. It's a valid concern. I definitely would be trying to tone it back. I would treat it like the heavy singles and heavy doubles at the end of a training cycle. You don't always need it. It's useful when you do need it, and just use it sparingly. Thanks very much for watching, guys. If you want training, consultancy, like one-to-one coaching, or if you want to have a look at some of our programs, go to sikastrength.com/shop. The link is down below. Thank you.